Imagine starting up what you assume will be a throwback-styled JRPG only to end up seeing full-on penetration play out in a cutscene. It's mostly my own fault for this, seeing as how I've sometimes requested keys for games without fully knowing what I'd be expecting, but at the same time, from what I initially saw of this game, I expected it to be similar to Earthbound or classic Sega JRPGs. I'm a big RPG fan, and something about the ones that take place in POV mode just stand out to me. I guess it's because less is more allows my imagination to fill in the blanks and make the experience more than it really is, but I just really like these kinds of RPGs. I went into the Heart of Darkness expecting to get that, but initially, I was pretty turned off by what this game had to offer. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a prude, and it's not as if I'm against what this company has in mind to achieve, or what others are into, but I'm not up for combining video games with pornography. I've definitely played all sorts of M-rated games that featured elements of sex, but not to the point where it was more or less a feature/calling card of the game. That's how this element of the game came off, and when I realized that's how the rest of it would be, I thought of what to do. I could have easily dropped the game and moved on, but seeing as how there were parts of it that still stood out to me, I wanted to know if there was a way for me to experience it without having to be exposed to graphic hentai cutscenes. Thankfully, there was an edited version that could be played, and that's what I ended up playing. I guess it goes to show that the erotic nature of the Heart of Darkness was a big part of this game because I immediately noticed that there was a large difference between the uncut and edited versions. From the start, I realized that there were less options to choose from when it came to character selection. From what I briefly saw of the uncut version of the game, there were around 4 or 5 character classes to choose from. When I was playing that version, I chose to play as the aristocrat. When I was playing the edited version, I saw that I could only choose the first character. That bummed me out, but I decided to keep playing because I assumed that just about everything else, minus the porn, would remain the same. Surprisingly, even the tamer parts of the game were cut in the edited version. I was left thinking that they would have at least included the characters/art that didn't depict porn. It could be because it's all or nothing, but it bummed me out to see that the cutscenes were greatly affected by playing the edited version. Some of the characters definitely came off as sexualized when they weren't featured in a pornographic scene, but it wasn't to the same level as the first cutscene that caught me off guard. I kept thinking that I would have liked the tamer parts of this game to be fully included because those didn't seem overboard. Being an anime fan since the mid-90s, you eventually get used to shows featuring fan service in one way or another. It bothers some more than others, but as I've been saying, it's not to the point where a show is unwatchable for me simply because it has fan service. I would have liked a better balance between the edited and uncut version of the Heart of Darkness because at the end of the day, this was an entertaining game, and this was shown in more ways than one. At this point in time, it's played out to say that a game is Soulsborne inspired. It's mainly because people will somehow manage to shoehorn that comment in, but when it comes to the Heart of Darkness, that really applies. The Soulsborne influences were all over the place, but the devs really favored Bloodborne. It wasn't just because of the overall aesthetics, but also because of certain design choices. Rather than having you return to where you previously died to recollect your dropped runes, you'd have to find a bloodstone. What caught my attention was that finding these required a lot of exploration and risk-taking. It was similar to how things are approached in Soulsborne games, but it had its own twist on things, and I liked that. It was especially nice because it forced me to seek out new areas of the sanctuary, and as a result of that, I either encountered new enemies, found items, or simply saw more of what this game had to offer. At first, I was a bit frustrated because even after I found the bloodstone and got my runes back, I didn't know how to use them to level up. I expected this game to be like other JRPGs I've played in the past, but it wasn't. It could just be that I haven't played enough retro JRPGs, and when I say retro, I mean like JRPGs from the 80s, so I probably just wasn't used to how things were back then. I was frustrated because I had close to 4,000 runes, but I didn't know how to use them. At one point this started to affect my playstyle because I was avoiding combat in order to avoid dying and potentially losing the runes I had accumulated. It was fun being forced to take risks that I probably wouldn't have taken if I wasn't pushed towards them, but things could have definitely been a bit clearer for me. As I was familiarizing myself with the overall game and the sanctuary, I quickly realized that a lot of time and effort went into this game's art design. It being Soulsborne inspired pretty much lets you know what kind of a setting to expect and what kind of enemies to encounter, but it was still nice to see that style of gameplay utilized in a retro-styled game. Besides the retro nature of the overall game, what most grabbed my attention were the enemy designs. With this being a retro-styled JRPG, it's not as if the graphics were on the same level as Elden Ring, but it was to the point where it sometimes reminded me of Castlevania, Symphony of the Night. What I mean is that Symphony of the Night was released at a point in time when most companies wanted to release 3D games. Unfortunately, a lot of those games didn't age well at all, but since Symphony of the Night was a great-looking pixel-based game, it's aged like fine wine. I'm sure that there are many different reasons as to why modern-day indie developers keep going back to the pixel-based art style, but in my opinion, it's because when it's done well, it's timeless. It's not only that the enemy designs look great, I also thought that some of them were disturbing. In general, I like to think that if your work can elicit any kind of emotion from me, it's done something right, and when it came to this game's enemy design, that was exactly the case. This is a pixel-based game that seems as if it'd be a better fit in the late 80s or early 90s, but it still managed to work well in 2022. It's not only that the in-battle enemy designs looked great, I liked how the enemies' shadows were different to give you an idea of what to expect. You still couldn't tell how many enemies you'd end up encountering, but based on how the shadow looked, you could tell whether or not the enemy would be easy to deal with or not. It was a simple design choice, but it worked, and I liked this kind of attention to detail. The devs could have easily had all shadows appear the same, but that would have resulted in a lesser experience. As I previously mentioned, during the first few hours with this game, I wasn't entirely sure how to get things done. I've played plenty of JRPGs, so I have a good idea of what generally applies to most of them, but things were different in the Heart of Darkness. I found myself wondering how leveling up characters was supposed to work. Could I only level up my party members? Was I stuck on level 1 as a result of playing the edited version of the game? It took longer than I would have liked to figure out how to level up my main character. I quickly learned that I could level up my party members as soon as they joined my party, thanks to having runes, but it took me around 6 hours before I learned what needed to be done to level up my main character. Narratively, it made sense, seeing as how I'd have to reach a certain point before I could start leveling up my character, but there was a bit of a clash when it came to the gameplay experience. It made me feel weak and forced me to fall back on defensive strategies in order to protect my main character. I didn't figure out if the game would be over if my main character were to die, or if I'd have a chance to revive him as long as the other party members were still active, so that's why my early playstyle was so heavily affected. It also didn't help that one of my party members was a mage. He had plenty of offensive spells, but the problem was that my ability to use them was limited by the amount of MP I had. That makes sense, seeing as how it's to avoid having the character be too overpowered. But the combination of this and not being able to level up my main character for an extended period of time created a bit of a bottleneck where I was forced into a certain playstyle. I would have preferred having more options to choose for myself. By the time that I learned how to level up, I realized that things still weren't as smooth as I would have liked. What I mean is that leveling up requires you to go back to what's more or less your base in order to level up. I would have liked having more control over when and where I could level up. If I were able to level up just about anywhere, chances are I would have spent more time enjoying the game instead of going in and out of the sanctuary a few times per play session. I could see why this was approached this way, seeing as how you'd sometimes get new items/dialogue options after having been in the sanctuary for a while, but I wanted to stay where I was. I'm not saying that this shouldn't have been a part of the game, but I would have liked an alternative option to have been available. Much like with certain Soulsborne games, you reach a point where more options are available to you at a bonfire, or whichever save point X Soulsborne game happens to use, as you progress through the game, so you don't feel the need to revisit specific areas as you were once required to early on. It was tedious to deal with this, but on the bright side, side quests being a thing in this game were a nice surprise. I say that, and yet I ended up thinking that side quests weren't approached as well as they could have been. It's because the dialogue that was required in order to accept the side quest took longer to get through than the side quest itself. You could say that the instructions made things easy for you, especially since I'd quickly find whatever it was that I happened to be looking for, but I wanted to spend more time playing rather than going through dialogue. I realize that makes me come off as someone that doesn't care about story or world building, but that's not what I was looking to get out of this game. You could say that building up my expectations for it prior to even playing was what eventually led to me being slightly disappointed. As strange as it may sound, part of me expected that this game would be a bit like Diablo 1. What I mean is that once I figured out that the entirety of the game would more or less take place in one area followed by multiple different sub-areas, I assumed that I'd be able to do what I was capable of doing in Diablo 1. I say that, and yet at the same time I acknowledge that it was wrong of me to have these expectations, seeing as how this is a game that's meant to be like late 80s/early 90s POV JRPGs. Diablo 1 and the Heart of Darkness do share some similarities, such as frequently having to go back to town to upgrade gear or buy needed supplies, but this was handled better in Diablo 1. The fact that this is a retro-styled game meant to come off as classic JRPGs from the late 80s/early 90s, it's easy to understand why some choices were made. I don't have first-hand experience of this, but based on what I've seen others mention here on YouTube, certain periods of time in gaming actually required you to have a pen and paper beside you to either make notes or map things out yourself. To some that may sound archaic or like needless work, but I can see how some would appreciate having to do this. Not only because it forces you to think creatively in order to overcome obstacles, but also because some players don't enjoy having their hand held. You could argue for or against what counts as hand-holding in video games, but having a map to work with is something I've come to expect from most of the games that I play. I know that some lack maps as a way of pushing you towards a certain playstyle, but sometimes that can work against you. In the Heart of Darkness, I'd say that it was a mix of both. From the start, you quickly realize how massive the sanctuary is. It's not only because of how different it is from other areas of the game, but also because there's a lot of ground to cover. It really depends on how you are as a gamer, but whenever I know that I'm in an area that has multiple floors, I prefer to stay and explore until I know that I've seen everything it has to offer. I'd like to say that it was possible in the Heart of Darkness, but that's not true. It's because the sanctuary has a lot of locked areas and shortcuts that are meant to be used at later points in the game. Still, it was nice to know that I was making progress and opening up the sanctuary. By the time that I was able to notice that progress was being made, I had already dealt with frustration due to having a difficult time keeping track of where I had been and where I had to go. The early floors of the sanctuary had so much to offer, it was easy to get lost, and that occurred more often than I would have liked due to the lack of a map. I could see some not having a problem with this at all, seeing as how it delivers a far more genuine experience of being lost in a labyrinth and having to figure things out on your own. For me, my preferences fall more towards the middle. I definitely want to feel as if I'm traversing unexplored locations, but at the same time, I like knowing that I have something like a map to fall back on. On the subject of exploring, I was surprised by how the Heart of Darkness approached world building and lore. I already mentioned that dialogue and side quests are part of this game, but I didn't expect books to flesh things out for you. When I was exploring the game's main hub, there was a library there. Part of me expected to get a generic dialogue box whenever I looked at the books, but surprisingly, they actually had something different for each shelf that was there. I thought that it was nice to know that this game had more to offer than what you initially expected, and it's a way of informing you of the past and present. I know that some people out there can't get enough lore, but for me it's either hit or miss. I either really love the lore that's available for a game or whichever piece of media I happen to be into at the time, or I just skim past it. In the Heart of Darkness, it was the latter. It was nice to know that it was there, but I just wanted to play. It also didn't help that this game was longer than I expected. Maybe it's because the indie games I request keys for tend to be around 3 to 5 hours long, so when I saw that this game had a lot to offer well after 3 hours, I was surprised. I wouldn't go so far as to say that this was a bad thing, but at the same time, I eventually reached a point where I just wanted to move on. It's because I felt that I had experienced just about everything the game had to offer, and it didn't help that I was playing an edited version. It's possible that the uncut version would have left me feeling more entertained as a result of everything that it would have offered, but I wasn't interested in giving it a try after that hardcore hentai scene caught me off guard. When it comes to combat, I'd say that things are fairly balanced, but it's also easy to end up accumulating a lot of damage. It was mainly my own fault, seeing as how I decided to just about fight every enemy I could, as a way of trying to get more out of the lesser version of this game, but after a while, I realized I couldn't keep that up. It was mainly because some of the enemies' difficulty level would spike up out of nowhere, even in areas that initially had you dealing with weak enemies. What bothered me about this was that sometimes low to mid-tier enemies would give you more runes than the ones that actually gave you a hard time. With the RPGs that I've played in the past, I've gotten used to being rewarded based on how difficult a battle was. In the Heart of Darkness, things weren't as balanced as well as they could have been. Sometimes you'd encounter a sick-looking enemy and you'd expect a lot from beating them, but the reward was occasionally disappointing, and I'd end up annoyed. Though I previously complained about the lack of a map, the good thing about that was all of the grinding I ended up doing as a result of exploring and trying to find the right way to go. Sometimes it was because I was lost and had no idea where I needed to go, but other times, much like in the garden, it was to reach a point where I could easily take on some of the tougher enemies. The majority of the enemies in the Heart of Darkness appeared as shadows, but there were some that appeared as they would in an actual battle. It was a great way of letting you know that these enemies would be harder to take out, and they did in fact come off as mini-bosses. Much like with other enemies, you could easily avoid these until you felt ready to take them on, but things were different in the garden. It didn't help that the garden was a maze-like area, and it had 2 mini-bosses that would chase after you. These were intimidating because of how fast and aggressively they chased after you. I could still avoid them, but their presence left me a bit hesitant to fully explore the garden. One of the issues I had with the Heart of Darkness is something that other RPG players joke about. It's the fact that you regularly save up rare/useful items for later, but in the end, you don't use them at all. I want to say that it's because I played the edited version of this game, so I wasn't able to use everything I would have liked to have used, but it was disappointing to have quickly amassed a collection of weapons and items that were either unusable or non-essential. What I mean is that I mainly stuck to basic attacks and certain skills that proved themselves to be useful. You could say that it was my own fault for not checking what all of the items I had were capable of doing, but my main issue was with the weapons and other equipment I'd collect. Whenever I found something that appeared to be better than the weapons or armor I had, I tried to use it. Unfortunately, sometimes the game wouldn't allow me to switch things out, mainly because it appeared that some items were more or less trademarks of the particular character I was using, or other times it would allow me, but there wasn't as big of a change as I expected. Seeing as how I didn't play the uncut version of this game, it's possible that this issue wouldn't have been present there, but as I've already said, I wasn't up for testing things out there. Having previously mentioned the ability to control when and where I'd fight, the good thing about this is that it also spilled over into the battles themselves. What I mean is that battles really aren't annoying when they can be done within 15 to 45 seconds. Even when it came to some of the boss battles, they'd only take me 10 to 15 minutes. When compared to other RPGs like Persona 4, which sometimes had boss battles that could easily take me over 45 minutes, this was a nice change of pace. I bring this up because even die-hard RPG fans will sometimes take issue with some that go overboard with how frequent enemy encounters occur, or how long battles can take. The solution to this in the Heart of Darkness was just right because you could control when to fight, when to avoid enemies, and even the battles themselves wouldn't last long. With how quickly some battles would end, it was easy to more or less be on autopilot. The problem with this is that sometimes I'd press enter really quickly and end up doing something I didn't mean to do. It's because the game would fall back on your last commands the next time it was your turn to attack. I can see how approaching combat this way would be useful, but it's a double-edged sword. Sometimes I'd end up wasting valuable MP when it wasn't necessary to attack an enemy with a spell, or other times I'd use an attack after having realized that it wasn't efficient. On the other hand, if this option wasn't available, I could see some boss battles being harder than they ended up being. I've briefly hinted at boss battles, and though they're definitely worth bringing up, they're not that big of a deal in this game. What I mean is that even if they're present, they weren't as memorable as in other RPGs. Off the top of my head, I can think of multiple different bosses from say FF7, Hojo, Rufus, the wall at the Temple of the Ancients, and the multiple forms of Genova. I realize that comparing a game like the Heart of Darkness to a legendary one such as FF7 isn't fair, but what I'm trying to say is that there's a big difference when it comes to boss battles and how they're presented. Honestly, the majority came off as glorified general enemies, and that was a bit of a letdown. For example, the first boss was a piece of cake. That was mainly my own fault, due to the amount of grinding I did before I even encountered it. I'm sure that the battle would have been more challenging had I encountered it sooner rather than later, but that still doesn't change the fact that most of the boss battles weren't memorable. The enemy designs for some looked great, but when it came to the gameplay side of things, it wasn't as satisfying as I would have liked for it to have been. As I previously mentioned, the garden featured 2 huge enemies. These 2 stood out to me not only because they'd aggressively chase after you, but they were bigger than the majority of the enemies that you'd previously faced, and they hit hard. It would have been nice had all boss battles been similar to these, but I can see how that ended up being too repetitive. Either way, it was nice that these enemies had something different to offer. The Heart of Darkness does enough work to flesh out its world and some of the lore behind it, but I wouldn't say it's on the same level as some of the Soulsborne games. It had a simple story to tell, and I'd say that was done on purpose because the point was to deliver a game that had a little to offer to many different people. I'm sure that there are some out there that would be into this game for different reasons. The hentai, the classic-styled JRPG gameplay, and the story that didn't force you to overthink things. What I'm getting at is that despite how things appear to be throughout the game, I expected the ending to be more than it was. I know that this once again goes back to the idea that I played an edited version of this game, and chances are that this too would affect how the ending would play out, but that's still a bummer to realize. It goes back to what I previously said, that it would have been possible to have edited out the hardcore hentai while still delivering the story it had to tell. It could be that just wasn't an option due to the hentai nature of this game being an integral part, but I wasn't satisfied with how things ended with the edited version. During the final boss fight, I expected the goddess to fight back, but it makes sense why she wouldn't. It's because it seems that she was more or less forced into the position that she was in. She was a hero for accepting the sacrifice and embracing the darkness, but as a result of being corrupted, she came off as evil to others. I could see not fighting as a way of acknowledging that it was the right thing to do for the greater good. Even if this fit with what the story had built up, I was still bummed out to realize that all of the dialogue that was part of this final encounter led to only one choice. The Heart of Darkness was a weird experience for me. It had a lot that I enjoyed, but at the same time, the full experience it had to offer just wasn't my cup of tea. For me, it's like combining pizza and mayonnaise. While I may enjoy both separately, I wouldn't be happy having a pizza that's slathered with mayonnaise. That's how I feel about this being an RPG with elements of hentai. It could just be that my vision of games just doesn't gel with that of the devs/company responsible for this game, and there's nothing wrong with that. What I will say is that despite the fact that I played an edited version of this game, and that may have greatly altered my experience with it, I still enjoyed what it had to offer, and it left me wanting to play similar styled JRPGs. I feel a bit conflicted as to whether or not I should recommend this game. It ultimately depends on what you're into, and to judge it for yourself. If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much for watching.